How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boylai Hobby Time. I was recently contacted by Paw Patrol. They asked if I would be willing to make a diorama featuring some of their new toys from the upcoming Dino movie to display at this year's San Diego Comic-Con. And I thought that sounded like a lot of fun. In addition to the dinosaurs, they sent over a bunch of pups as well, which I'm going to be integrating into a little jungle island scene. And the first step was to make a base. This thing will potentially be moved around quite a bit, so I wanted to make a nice sturdy base that could survive transportation. I bought some 1x2 inch boards from Home Depot that were pre-cut, and then I post-cut them. Then I threw each corner into a 90-degree corner clamp before nailing it together. After all four corners had been nailed together, I threw a cross beam in the middle, giving me a nice support for an MDF sheet, which I will be building the rest of the terrain on top of. Well, technically it was 2 MDF sheets. I couldn't find one that was big enough to cover the whole thing. But after those had been tacked in place, cut off the excess, and I sanded the sides with my orbital sander. Off camera, I made another frame for the back wall, and I nailed that down as well, making sure that the nails made it all the way through into the other frame, so everything was nice and sturdy. With a rigid floor and backdrop, I could then move on to building the terrain itself. Timmy and Rhubarb stepped in to help figure out the spacing and the sizing of the landscape, and once that had been figured out, I began slicing the foam. The plan here is to have a rocky cliff face on either side, framing a nice big volcano in the distance. And in the front, some hills with different elevations for the pups to stand on. I used a utility knife to carve the rocks. I moved down to the faces of those plateaus to give them some interest. And then finally, to add some variation to the flat surfaces, I torched them with a butane torch. Foam, dust, and fumes are nothing to mess around with, so make sure you have good airflow and ventilation if you ever try this. Here you can see the general layout that I'm going for. Timmy does need to look more like he's running. There are a few other things that need to change, but that's the basic idea. With the general layout basically done, I could then move on to gluing all of the foam pieces together. I did just glue the foam together. I did not glue this down to the base quite yet. It will be helpful to keep those separate until pretty much the very end. The next step was to get some nice organic earth texture on the foam and patch up some of those gaps using some Sculptamold. Sculptamold is essentially a paper mache mix with plaster, and once you add water, it can be used to make some pretty cool stuff. The key here was to blend the vertical sections into the flat sections by filling the corners and smoothing it in both directions. After that, I made the rest of the dirt. To protect the remaining exposed foam surfaces, I mixed up some black paint and Mod Podge. This is thin enough to get into all the cracks without removing the detail, but will also dry with a nice hard shell. If I had used Sculptamold for this, I would have lost all of the rock details that I spent so much time carving. Off camera, you can see that I added some rocks to the dirt, and those steps will all take a little bit of time to dry, so let's set that aside and work on our characters. As mentioned before, in the dino department we have Timmy, that's the large T-Rex, Rhubarb, the baby T-Rex, and a bunch of compies. And these look nice right now, but the request was to have them repainted to look more screen accurate, so that's what we're going to work on next. The first step was to change the position of Timmy's leg to be in more of a running position. To do that, I heated up the plastic with the heat gun and bent that further back, and then I did that with the toes as well. The next step was to open up the toy, create a path for some wires that will get power to the new lights that I'm putting in the harness. I had a little bit of trouble figuring out how this thing came apart, but once I removed the vest, I found a couple more screws that I had missed the first time. I also wanted to figure out how to open up the head so I could adjust the mouth and eye position. I actually couldn't figure out how to do that, so I just gave up and I set the jaw at a certain openness, and then I moved back to creating my path for the wires. After setting a metal tube in the foot for those wires, I sliced up the vest to allow some lights to shine through. I removed the whole face of this light, cut out the little vents off camera, removed all of the excess that I needed to, and then glued the face back on. And I'm really happy with the results. I was then able to figure out where I needed to cut on the shoulders of the dinosaur as well. Got all of my wiring figured out, and the LEDs put in place, and it was time to put Timmy back together. As I was putting him back together, I noticed these little rails on the tail, which you can use to mount other pups. Figured it would look better to have those removed, because I'm not going to be putting anybody else up there. I put the head back in place, as well as the harness and the backpack for Rex. And I used a 2-part epoxy putty to patch up the seams that made him look more toy-like and less realistic. I used a small ballpoint stylus to match the texture of the skin onto the putty, and then I smoothed it out with some isopropyl alcohol. That will take a decent amount of time to cure, so in the meantime, let's get to painting the rest of the characters. I threw the crew on some painting handles side by side, along with the compies. I will be taking everyone off later when I do the detail painting. I took everybody outside and gave them a coat of gray primer with a spray paint can, and then it was time to break out the airbrush. I used some black to give everyone some nice contrast, spraying them in all the shaded areas and from below. And then it was time to add some color, starting with rhubarb. I started with the dark rusty red, and then I increased the brightness and saturation of the red, and then worked back toward a nice warm pink highlight. The eyes already looked great before the painting process, so I was sure to mask those off, and once I peeled away the mask, rhubarb looked great, and it was time to move on to the puppies. I loaded up the airbrush with a pure white, which I applied from above and onto their faces to help increase the brightness. And then I broke out the wet palette, and it was time to start painting on the colors. Like I said before, I started with all of the pups side by side on painting handles. I very quickly realized how unnecessary that was, and honestly silly it was to try and work around the others and avoid getting paint on them. So in the end, I decided to just snap them all off and paint them individually. Just like with the dinos, I was asked to repaint the rest of the crew to look more screen accurate to the movie. You may be wondering if they came in color, why the need to repaint them. But given the practical limitations of manufacturing, a lot of these colors had to just be one solid color, but with hand painting, you can get a little bit of shading and some highlights and pick out those details that really add to the realism. Painting minis is also just a lot of fun. I enjoyed looking at my reference photos, blocking in all of the main colors and shapes, and picking out all those fine details. Mini painting is one of my favorite parts of this hobby. I'm really glad that they asked me to repaint everyone. If you're a fan of Paw Patrol, or if you have any kids who are fans of Paw Patrol, let me know in the comments which of these is your favorite. Personally, I think Marshall the Dalmatian was my favorite to paint. As fun as it was to paint all these pups, it definitely took longer than I had anticipated. When I started the build, I didn't really think through what repainting everyone would entail, time-wise. And once the pups were all finally done, I was definitely ready to move on to the big dino. But it was still a lot of fun. Also, I painted all of the compies off camera. By now, the epoxy putty was fully cured, and Timmy was ready for that same coat of gray primer that everybody else got. Just like last time, I broke out the airbrush. I applied black into all of the recesses and underneath, kind of like a pre-shading step that you would apply to a model kit. After that, I broke out the rusty red once again as the darkest shade of Timmy's skin tone. Even though Timmy got the same base color as rhubarb, this time round I added yellow, increasing the brightness, moving through orange and then all the way up into yellow, and then finally an almost white yellow for the highlights. You can also see I switched to the camera angle here. That's to give a little bit more light for you guys from the viewing angle and see the process of building up these volumes on Timmy even better. I applied a nice warm glaze to tie everything together with the airbrush. I switched over to the wet palette once again to apply the details. After the detail work on the scales, I jumped over to the harness, which got a metallic blue in most places, as well as dark gray, green, and some silver trim. With that brushwork figured out, Timmy was done, and like I said, I grabbed those compies and I painted them off camera. The painting process was not quite finished yet because, of course, I had a huge unpainted landscape that I needed to work on next. The rocks and the earth got a base coat of rusty red, followed by warm earthy brown, followed by lighter and lighter shades of gray, especially on the rocks to help them look, well, a little bit more rocky. Once the landscape had its base coats and I still had the airbrush out, it was time to paint the backdrop. The idea here is a still smoking and slightly steamy distant volcano. Decided to do it with an airbrush to achieve a softer and more distant look. Because there are no brush strokes and everything kind of blends together, it's easier to achieve some nice atmospheric perspective. It's also fun to get some practice in with the airbrush. Usually I am working on small three-dimensional things or very tiny backdrops, so having a nice big backdrop like this was a fun change of pace. I actually used to do quite a bit of painting back in the day with oils and watercolors on canvas, kind of like this. But I've never really shown that on this channel. If that's something that you would be interested in seeing more of, let me know in the comments. Might have to do that. After the backdrop, it was time to wrap up the terrain. I used multiple pigment powders to give the dirt a realistic look, focusing the lightest powder in the middle to build up somewhat of a vignette, hopefully bringing attention to the main characters who will be standing in the middle. And finally, it was time to make this jungle island an actual jungle by throwing on a bunch of plant life. It's not really alive though, it's all plastic, but you know what I mean. Got a whole wide variety of plastic plants at the hobby store, and I went to town. Once I was happy with my little plastic jungle, it was time to put the characters in place. I drilled through the floor into the feet of the big dinosaurs to make sure they were nice and secure. Although I did hear that rhubarb came loose in shipping, which is a bummer. Luckily, that's not the one with the wiring. The rest of the pups I put in place, putting a metal rod in their foot and then gluing them down to the base. Okay, we're closing in on the finished project here, but first we gotta clean up these sides, and for that we'll be using wooden veneer with an adhesive backing. I cut out all of the strips and pieces that I needed, and then I made the classic mistake of hitting pause when I thought I hit record. So that was nice. Either way, I got footage of the sides being cleaned up. Used my X-Acto blade and a nice, clean, sharp blade to trim that down to match the profile exactly. To clean up the rough edges on the sides and the bottom, I used my orbital sander. Here we got the electronics set up. It's pretty simple. We got the batteries connected to a potentiometer so that the brightness can be adjusted to whatever is desired, and all of it is connected to this subtle little switch on the side. And finally, the last thing to do was to clean up the sides of the diorama by painting them matte black with the airbrush. And after that, I called it good. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Like I said at the beginning, this will be on display at San Diego Comic-Con. If you are there, go to the SpinMaster booth to find it. Huge shout out to Paw Patrol and SpinMaster for giving me the opportunity to work on this. I hope you guys love it. And a massive shout out, as always, to my patrons who help keep this channel going. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.